Thor and the Jotun Geirrod. Once, when he had nothing better to do, Loki took on the shape of a falcon and flew off to see what he could see. He happened to fly to the hall of Geirrod, one of the strongest of the Jotuns, and wondered what might be going on inside. So he glided down and perched on a window's ledge, high up under the eaves. Down the hall he saw Geirrod sitting among his men, drinking and carousing by the fire, and boasting that he could easily conquer Asgard were it not for Thor and his hammer. As he raised his drinking horn to take another mighty swallow, he caught sight of the falcon up on the ledge. "Bring me that bird!" he roared to one of his men. Loki snickered as he watched the man clambering and clawing his way up the high slippery wall, but when it was time for him to fly away he found that he could not move. The Jotun had put a spell on him. So the man caught him and brought him down to Geirrod. "This is no bird," said the Jotun when he looked into Loki's eyes. "It is someone in disguise. Speak, tell me who you are." But Loki did not open his beak. He only stared back at the Jotun. "I'll teach you to talk," yelled Geirrod, and shut him up in a chest. There he kept him for 3 months with nothing to eat or drink, and when he took him out, Loki had grown so hungry and meek that he not only admitted who he was, but he also promised to do whatever Geirrod wanted, if only Geirrod would spare his life. "I'll let you go," said the Jotun with an evil grin, "if you will swear to bring Thor to me without his weapons." Whimpering, Loki swore to do what the Jotun asked, and took off for Asgard as fast as he could. When he got home, he gorged himself with food and drink. Then, patting his stomach, he went to the glutton Thor. He said, "I have just returned from Jotunheim, where I had quite a meal at Geirrod's hall. He brags loudly about his strength, but really he isn't much of a Jotun. I almost threw him in a friendly wrestling match before the meal, and you could throw him with your little finger. But he sets the finest table. You should have tasted the salmon and the savory roasts and the foaming beer." So much did Loki talk about the food that Thor must have some too. And the end of it was that Thor set off with Loki for Geirrod's hall, leaving his weapons at home. For who, as Loki said, would believe that he came to Jotunheim on a friendly visit if he brought his hammer, his iron mitt, and his belt for strength? On the way they stopped at the hall of the giantess Grid. She was the mother of Thor's half-brother Vidar, so she was friendly with the Aesir. When she heard that Loki and Thor, without their weapons, were on their way to Geirrod's hall, she took Thor aside and said, "Geirrod isn't a glutton at all, but very strong, but a very strong and cunning Jotun. Don't let yourself be fooled. Here, take my iron mitt and my magic belt, and also my magic staff, and watch your step." Thor thanked her, hid the belt and mitt under his coat, took the staff in his hand, and went on his way as if nothing had happened, with Loki at his side. But as they were fording a wide river, the water suddenly rose. Ramming Grid's staff down as hard as he could, Thor kept his feet from being swept away, and Loki hung on to him while the river rose higher and higher. The water had almost reached his neck before Thor caught sight of a giantess straddling the river up above. It was she who made the river rise. Thor picked up a boulder from the bottom of the river and flung it at her, and the boulder did not miss its mark. Screaming, the giantess raced off. She was one of Geirrod's daughters, who had been sent to drown them. "Rivers must be stemmed at their source," said Thor. Fortunately, a rowan tree was hanging over the river. Thor caught hold of one of the branches and hauled himself and Loki to safety and walked on. When they arrived at Geirrod's, they were shown into a little house. It was furnished with only one stool, but Thor was not choosy. He sat down on the stool, and as soon as he was seated, he felt the stool begin to move upward. Higher and higher he went, up toward the roof beam, and he saw that soon his head would be crushed. Then Thor put Grid's staff against the roof beam, and pushed with all his might, and what with his own muscles and Grid's belt of strength, it was quite a push. The stool, with Thor on it, crashed down to the floor. Then there was a loud cry, and when Thor looked, there under the stool lay two of Geirrod's daughters, who had been lifting the stool. Their backs were broken instead of his head. "Now I know what kind of a meal is waiting for me in Geirrod's hall," said Thor. When the servants called him for dinner, he put Grid's iron midden in his hand, to be ready for his welcome, and walked into the hall. Geirrod was standing by the fire with a pair of tongs in his hand. The moment he saw Thor, he grabbed a red-hot bolt out of the embers and flung it at him. Thor caught it in his mitt and flung it back with all his might. The Jotun ducked behind a pillar, but the glowing bolt flew through the pillar, through the Jotun, through the wall of his hall, and deep into the ground behind it. "One evil Jotun less is better than the grandest meal," said Thor, and he bore Loki no grudge. But he returned to Asgard with a greater appetite than ever.